In this video, we're going to handle with our game on the canvas, we're going to handle the input from the user a little bit differently. We're going to use the left and right arrow keys to rotate our component, and the up and down arrows to accelerate or decelerate. So in order to do this, we need to get an understanding on how to rotate our objects. In the way it works, objects are not being rotated in the context. As you remember, we don't have a reference to the objects that we draw in the scene. So the way you rotate objects is there's one in particular that you're trying to rotate. You're going to save the canvas as it is before you draw the object you're trying to rotate. So everything else is going to be saved. Then you're going to translate if needed to the object that you're trying to rotate, and then you're going to rotate the canvas, and then, or not the canvas but the context, and then you're going to draw your object in that orientation on the canvas, and then after that you can restore the canvas, so your object will be drawn at this angle that you have chosen, and then the rest will be put back on the screen in their original orientation. So in order to do a little example with this, we're going to start back from a new HTML file. You can see here in the one that I have set up, I just have a title I called Game Movement. I'm linked to my Game Manager JavaScript file, which is empty right now. And then when the body is loaded, I'm going to call the function start game. So now I'm going to move on to my Game Manager file. And right now there's absolutely nothing in it. So I'm going to redefine some of the elements that we have defined before, such as the game area. And then I'm going to set it up so it's going to have a canvas property. And then we're going to use the document.create element. And then in between quotation marks, we specify that we want to create a canvas element. That's kind of what we've done before. Then I'm going to define the start function. And in that start function, I'm going to set up some of the properties for the canvas, like the width, for example. And I'm going to use the same dimensions that I used before. I think it was 480 by 270. I'm going to set up the height in the similar fashion, and then here we use 270. I'm going to get a reference to the context, nothing new there. I'm using the method getContext and then 2D as an argument to get this particular context to draw on. Then I need to make sure I insert that canvas in the document. So document.body is the portion where I want the canvas to be added, and then I can just append child here on this one. No need to try to, I don't have anything in my HTML. So append child will do, and add that canvas to my body. Then I need to set up the interval. Remember, that's what allows me to have a game loop kind of thing. So I'm going to call the setInterval function. I'm going to use the update game area, just like we have before. And I'm going to call it every 20 milliseconds, which is about 50 times per second. I'm going to keep the events for the keyboard. So we're going to add an event listener, for key down. Remember, when you set up the add event listener method, the name of the event does not include the on key down, for example, it's just key down. And then I can specify the function. Here I can get some information about the event that becomes particularly useful because I need to figure out which key was pressed. If you remember, we had set up a game area dot keys which was an array for the keys. So here we're going to either reassign it its own value if it already exists, or if it doesn't exist, we're going to create an empty array when a key is being pressed. And then for that array at the position that is represented by the key code, so I can use e.keycode to refer back to the key that was pressed by the user, and I can set that value to true. Of course, I'm going to need to define another event listener when the key is released. So that's going to be key up. And in that case, I'm going to have another function that will require knowing which key was pressed. So I need to have a reference to the event. And then in that case, GameArea.keys already exists because I can't release a key unless I've pressed on it. And then e.keycode for the position in the array, and I can set that back to false when I release the key. So that's my start function here, which ends right here. I can set up a comma, and then create my new my next function, which is the clear function, if you remember, in the way that we had it defined before. And then we had used this dot context dot clear the rectangle. If you remember, you put the coordinates of the top left corner, so that's 0, 0 here, and then we want to use the width of the canvas and the height of the canvas for the dimensions of that rectangle. So that's what the clear function does, and that's about all we need for our game area for now. The next one, we are going to still define our birdie. We're going to go back to the rectangle just to keep our code a little bit simpler. We're going to define the component function, which we already had specified before. So I'm going to use the width, the height, the color. I go back to the initial one, and then an x coordinate and a y coordinate where to place it. We're not going to have a type here. We're kind of simplifying the code just a little bit. So I can set up some of these values here. I'm going to set up a width property, which I will assign the width value provided in the instantiation. Same thing with the height. I'm going to set that to the value provided in the instantiation. I'm going to define the x coordinate, the y coordinate, as well as those are going to be properties of the component. I'm going to add a new one, which will be the angle. And at the beginning, I'm going to set it to 0. I think that's about all the properties we need. Let's create our update function. So we're going to call that to redraw our rectangle. So the way we're going to do this is we are going to get a variable that it's local variable that we're going to call context, and that's GameArea.context. That just makes our code a little bit easier there. So I said when we want to rotate something, first we have to save it. Save the context. This way, everything that has been drawn so far is being saved and set aside for later on when we're done doing what we're doing. Next, we're going to translate the context so that it's at the same location as our rectangle. So I'm going to do a ctx.translate. And then the coordinates that I will provide are the coordinates of the component. So this dot x and this dot y. So that I've translated my canvas to a specific location. Next, I need to do the rotation. So here, what I'm rotating is not the rectangle. I haven't had access to it at all. I'm just rotating the context so that I can draw in it. I'm going to rotate it by the angle. And then finally, I can set up the fill style and then the rectangle. So now my context is kind of like crooked at an angle, specified here in the rotate function. And then I can just draw my rectangle as if nothing was going on. So I'm going to set the fill style to the color specified in the instantiation. And then I'm going to call the ctx.fillRect. We're going to use, instead of rotating through the top left corner, that'll look kind of weird, we're going to draw a rectangle so that its former origin is now the center. So that's why I'm using the this.width divided by 2 for the x coordinate, where I'm going to start drawing. And this should be negative, sorry. Let's put the negative here. Then it should be negative this dot height divided by 2, and that is just so that the center of the rectangle will be the corner of my context. It'll make the rotation look a little bit better that way. And then I use the width and the height of the component for the width and the height of the rectangle, which actually technically will be a square. And then, so now my component that needs to be rotated is drawn. So all I need to do is restore the context to its original position with its original information, and then that's what I'm doing here. So if we're looking at this image just to kind of visualize a little bit what the translation and rotation do, let's imagine the grid is actually the context and the white rectangle in the background is the canvas, or at least some of it anyway. So my origin is at the top left corner. When I translate the context, I'm actually moving that grid here to the top left corner of my rectangle, or the one that I want to draw at an angle. Then the next step is to do the rotation. Again, that's going to rotate the grid. And if I leave it as it is using the 0, 0 coordinates, then I'm going to be rotating my rectangle through its top left corner, which is not ideal. That's why when I did the drawing here, I kind of moved my rectangle to be over here instead, so that it would be pinched through its center when rotating. Then the position is still going to be the top left corner, but it will appear when it's rotating, it will appear to be rotating through its center. So now let's go back to our code and add the few items that we are needing to finish up here. So we had the component defined. Maybe after the definition of the component, I'm going to work on the functions. If you remember, there was the start game function. That's the one, if we're looking back on our HTML, this is the one that's being called when I'm loading the body of the HTML page. So that's needed. What I need to do here is start the game area, which is what I'm doing here. And then I can instantiate my birdie. So birdie equals, it's going to be a new component. I'm going to assign the width and the height of 30, 30 like before. I'm going to make it blue because I like blue better. And then I'm going to set the coordinate to be 10 and 120. And my semicolon needs to be outside of the parentheses there. All right, that's great. And then I also need to define the update game area function. There it is. So we're going to do that right now. If you remember, we had to do the game area.clear in the past to make sure that we're clearing up anything that was drawn on the previous frame. And then I'm going to change the angle of the bird by incrementing it. I like to think in degrees, so I would like to rotate it 1 degree per frame. The issue is that the angle that is needed in JavaScript for the rotation function is requiring radians. So we can do a quick conversion here by using the math.pi divided by 180. And that just quickly converts my 1 degree into radians there. And let's not forget to do our update for the birdie. There we are. So let's try and save this and see how it impacts our game. So I'm going to need a refresh here, and I'm having a couple of issues. So line 2, I'm having a semicolon that doesn't belong. Well, that's very true. If you remember when we're instantiating our objects by creating directly an instance, all of the elements that are provided here, such as the canvas, the start, and the clear, they need to be separated by commas, and here I had a semicolon. So there's one mistake fixed. Let's hope I don't have too many more. Let's refresh up here. Line 18, there comes another error, unexpected identifier. I think I have this value here. I have no idea how it ended up being there. Probably an error, so I need to have a semicolon there. I did not notice I had a typo. So I go back to the append child here, and I forgot, it must be getting late, that I needed to specify what child to append to the body. That'd be kind of useful. Hopefully you noticed that and you fixed it while you were following along. And if you did not notice it, just like me, then you can fix it now. So I need to make sure I specify what I'm going to append there. And then when I rotate it here, it's rotating. It's a little bit on the edge, so maybe I can move it to the right. So when I instantiate my component in the start of the game, instead of specifying 10 here, maybe I'm going to specify 50, so it'll be more to the right hand side. And if I refresh, there it goes. So it's rotating, and it does look like it's rotating through its center, which is pretty useful. All right, let's go back to our code now and add some motion to our component so that it doesn't move on its own, but actually with the keys of the keyboard, that'd be a little bit more helpful. So first we're going to add a speed to our component. So we had the X, the Y, the angle. Let's add one more property, which we're going to call speed, and we're going to set it to 1 from the get-go. That could be different, it doesn't matter. The next thing is we're going to create also within our component a move function, kind of like what we had done before. This way we're going to call our move method instead of just changing automatically the angle like we did in the update game area. And here we're going to do a little bit of trigonometry where we are going to modify the x coordinate depending on the speed and the angle of the object. So the x coordinate is going to be incremented by the this.speed, and then we're going to multiply that by, if you remember, is the sine of the angle. So it'll be math.sine and then this.angle. And then same thing goes for the y coordinate, except that this one is going to be the negative cosine. So minus equals the this.speed times the math.cosine and then this.angle here. So that's just a little bit of trigonometry. If you have questions about that, you can come and ask me next week in class, or you can take a look at some examples with the sine and the cosine to determine how they impact the x and y coordinates. So that's great. Now we're going to make sure also that we calculate the angle by using a move angle, and then you'll see a little bit how we're going to use that move angle. We're going to modify the move angle and the speed to be able to move our object, our component, and then that will work out pretty nicely. So let's define another property with our component, and we're going to call it move angle, and we're going to set it to 1 as well, so it's kind of like a rotational speed to a certain extent. And then in our move function, we're going to calculate that value, or calculate the value of the angle of the component by using the move angle. So we're going to use move angle for that. And then our move angle is going to be specified in degrees, so we're going to convert that into radians, because the rotate functions is taking radians as an argument. All right, so far so good. So basically, when I'm going to move the keys, I'm going to adapt the value of the move angle and of the speed for my component. And then my move function is going to use these values that have been entered by pressing left, right, up, and down keys. And they're going to translate that into new coordinates for my sprite. So that makes things kind of convenient that way. Let's go to the update game area where we're going to handle the keyboard. So I'm going to comment out the code where I changed automatically the angle of the bird. And here I'm going to set from the get-go the move angle to be 0, so that if I release any keys, then the bird no longer rotates. And same thing for the speed. If I release the keys, then the bird no longer moves. So if I don't have any keys pressed, I don't keep on moving, because it's a little confusing. Next, I'm going to check for the keys being pressed. So let's consider the left arrows. If you remember, we are using GameArea.keys. So if GameArea.keys exists, then I can check if a key was the key 37 was pressed. 37 is the key for the left arrow, if you remember. So if that is true, that means that's the key I have pressed. In that case, I'm going to change the angle of the birdie by decrementing it by 1, or by setting it to -1, sorry. I'm going to repeat very similar code for the right key, the right arrow. So in that case, the value is going to be 39. I need to update my comment, and then also set the move angle to a +1. The next key is going to be working out similarly. I'm going to check that the GameArea.keys exists, and if it does, I'm going to also check whether I have pressed key number 38. So in that case, 38, I believe, is the down or up? It's the up key, I think. We'll see. If that changes the birdie incorrectly, so the speed, I'm going to set that to 1. And similarly, for key number 40, if you remember, that would be the down key. In that case, I set the speed to -1. Before I can update the birdie, I need to make sure I call the move function. There it goes. Let's give it a try. So I'm saving this, refreshing my browser. I'm no longer moving. So if I press the right key, it's going to the right. If I press the left key, it's rotating to the left. If I press the up key, I'm moving forward. I'm leaving the area. If I press the down key, I'm moving left. And I could press multiple keys at the same time and do whatever movement I need to do here. Can't really see what's the top and what's the bottom anymore, but you get the idea. And this concludes our little video here on how to move the component by rotating it and then moving it forward and back. Thank you for watching.